Good afternoon and welcome to the Senior Statesmen of Virginia's January program, a dialogue on criminal justice reform. I'm Jeff Gould, President. Senior Statesmen was founded some 25 years ago as a not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to bringing topics of importance to seniors throughout the Central Virginia area. Our programs are always free and open to the public. Today we have two gentlemen, and by full disclosure, I should say that I worked with these two guys for many years, and it was a great privilege and pleasure to do so. Jim Hingley took office as the Commonwealth Attorney for the County of Albemarle in January of 2020. Prior to that, he served as a public defender here in the area from 1998 till 2016. He's a graduate of Harvard, UVA Law, Joe Platini School of Law. He also worked in the public defender's office before serving in the Charlottesville office of the Commonwealth Attorney. Gentlemen, welcome today. I want to tell our audience that we're going to have some brief opening statements from our two guests, and then you may submit questions and answers by going to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Today's forum will be recorded and available through our website probably by as early as tomorrow. So, gentlemen, let's get started with a couple of questions that have come in already. How has the pandemic impacted the work of your offices? And I'm gonna back up just a minute and let you two guys. Joe, would you start with a statement if you wanted to?
Sure. So I'd like to thank you and Rich and my friend and colleague Jim and the Senior Statesmen of Virginia for inviting us to join and have this important discussion. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my background, and I'm hoping Jim does the same because I think it'll sort of be useful for the topics we're going to talk about. I graduated from Providence College in 1994 and was accepted to Washington and Lee University School of Law, and I deferred my acceptance for a year to participate in the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. And I went down to Houston, Texas, and taught in an inner city school there. And one of the things that year sort of instilled in me was a desire to do something with my life that in some perhaps small way contributed to social justice, which is one of the four tenets of the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. So I went to Washington and Lee. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life or with my law degree, but I got involved in a clinical program where we were, as law students, helping attorneys that were appointed to defend death row inmates or defend individuals charged with capital murder in Virginia. And that was the Virginia Capital Case Clearinghouse. And really just fell in love with criminal law through that program, and especially the defense side of it. Through that program, met Liz Murtaugh, who was a W&L grad, and Jim Hingley, just our paths crossed. When I graduated, I went to Richmond and worked at the Virginia Resource Center doing appellate post-conviction work representing death row inmates in their appeals. And I found I was not particularly good at appellate litigation. I wanted to be in a courtroom trying cases. And Jim was opening the public defender's office along with Liz Murtaugh, his deputy, in 1999. And I didn't know anything about Charlottesville, had no connections here, no UVA connections, but I applied. And was fortunate enough to be hired by Jim and Liz as one of the original public defenders. And I loved my job. I loved working for Jim. But after about 4.5 years, I realized that the local prosecutors had a really strong voice in the system and could really impact what happened to my clients. And so I talked to Jim, and he was supportive. I don't think he wanted me to necessarily go because we had such a great office, but he was wonderful. And I applied and again was fortunate to be hired by Dave Chapman, the then Commonwealth's attorney, in 2003. And then Dave retired in 2017. I ran for Commonwealth's attorney and have been in the post since January 1st of 2018. And I'll just wrap it up by saying I didn't always want to be a prosecutor. I didn't always want to work for victims. I was drawn to the work of prosecuting because of my clients as a public defender. And I've grown to appreciate the importance of community safety and working with victims of crime and law enforcement agents by being a prosecutor. But, you know, we have a mission statement in our office, which is to balance community safety with the fair treatment of offenders. And we try and have that guide every decision we make. And to the extent that I get it right and the people in the office get it right, I just wanted to give a shout out that Jim's largely responsible for sort of shaping me and my philosophy early on in my career. So thanks. Looking forward to a robust conversation. Jim, I'll pass it off to you.
Well, thank you, Joe, and I appreciate your observation that maybe there's some ways in which I was able to contribute to your development into a prosecutor, an excellent prosecutor, I have to say. Joe and I have a lot of ways in which we have intersected over the time that we've known each other. But even before we knew each other, Joe just described to you an experience he had after college where he was in the Jesuit volunteer corps teaching. I also had a similar experience. I graduated from college in 1969 and through the VISTA volunteer program. And many of you will remember VISTA. It was Volunteers in Service to America. I was placed as a teacher in a rural isolated community in West Virginia that was having difficulty filling up the ranks of faculty in its high school. So I taught public high school for 2 years through a volunteer program. And it was a great experience, I think probably similar in many ways to Joe's, but it started me off with having the ambition to be of public service. And I believe that I've carried forward that ambition throughout my career. Before I took office as the Commonwealth's attorney in Albemarle County, I had been a criminal defense lawyer and public defender for 43 years, quite a long while. And so it's my path to prosecution is different from Joe's. Joe's started out as a public defender and then moved to a prosecutor's office, got a lot of experience, and then in 2017 was elected the chief prosecutor for Charlottesville. My path was different, but the similarity is that, as Joe said, one of the reasons he wanted to become a prosecutor is what he had learned by being a public defender. And I learned the same things. What he and I learned was what's really driving crime in our community from the standpoint of representing the people who are committing crimes. And also, we had, from that experience, a lot of ideas of how we could do things differently to improve community safety and also address crime in our community in a constructive way rather than the way that we've been doing it. So that approach to prosecution has been called or labeled progressive prosecutor approach. So Joe and I are both progressive prosecutors. And basically that means that we are committed to criminal justice reform. We're committed to doing things differently. And that's the subject of the forum today. And I'm looking forward to participating and answering questions. Thank you, Senior Statesman, for this invitation.
Thank you, gentlemen. Let's get back to that first question that I jumped ahead on. How has the pandemic impacted the work of your office during these last 10 months, I guess it is now? Joe, you want to try that one?
Sure. So one of the things we tried to do before COVID hit was take a look at individuals that we were asking for active jail or prison sentences to be handed down by judges or juries. And so before COVID hit, we had, I think, reduced the usage by the local jail for city inmates by 10 or 15%, somewhere around there. So we had started trying to take a hard look very early on in 2018 about what we were using the jail for. And so we had started to get our numbers down. And then COVID hit in March. Jim can talk about this. He was less than 90 days into his first term. And I think that we have a very collegial local bar system with a lot of different stakeholders having good relationships with each other. Not that we always agree, but we're able to sort of communicate. And we try and take a collaborative approach to solving problems. And so Jim, being the Commonwealth's attorney in the county, and myself in the city, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, we, play a pretty significant role in a number of individuals that are in jail. And so Jim and I quickly sort of worked together with judges and clerks and the defense bar and the public defender's office and the superintendent of the jail, and tried to figure out how to get our jail population even lower to try and make sure we didn't have a rapid spread of COVID. And I think we've been able to have drug and alcohol screens, and they can be monitored. And again, all this was done through the lens of trying to balance public safety with the fair treatment of offenders. So that was one big piece that hit us quickly, that I feel like we got everyone around the table together. And I don't know if I mentioned judges, but also judges who reviewed and approved all this. So that was one thing we did. And then the other thing is just really trying to keep all the users of the court system safe. And people, again, have done a really good job of putting different safety precautions in place to try and have us be safe and responsible in order to sort of conduct business for defendants and victims and law enforcement officers. And so I think we've done a pretty good job of working through the issues, and they're certainly difficult, but I think we've managed to sort of get through it better than most communities.
Can I add to that, please? Thank you. Joe's exactly right about the collaborative effort that we participated in with other stakeholders in the community to reduce the population of the jail. And it was reduced substantially. And there were a number of things that were done to achieve that reduction. A large number of people were able to be released on home electronic incarceration. And for the viewers who may not be familiar with that term, they're still serving a jail sentence, but they're not serving it in the jail. They're serving it under supervision outside the jail at their residence under strict conditions, depends on the circumstances, but they have conditions, and they're fully monitored while they're on home electronic incarceration. Other things that we did to try to reduce the jail population included, for new cases, having requesting either no jail or less jail than ordinarily would have been requested. So for incoming inmates, we're reducing the number. We also used furloughs creatively, delayed reporting dates, a whole number of different strategies that were employed in order to reduce the population of the jail. And we were very successful at that. The jail's population was reduced to levels really lower than anybody can remember and has been keeping track. It was a huge reduction in the number of people in the jail. Of course, the jails, as we all know, are significant, have significant potential for COVID outbreak. So by reducing the number of people in the jail, we're reducing somewhat the risk of an outbreak. And then if an outbreak occurs, there's room to space people apart that you didn't have when the jail was overcrowded. So from those two angles, we were able to substantially reduce the risk of a COVID outbreak at the jail. And again, sometimes people think about that as being the risk of the people who are in the jail getting COVID. And of course, that's a very substantial risk, one that we have to pay close attention to. But the fact is that our jails are community institutions, and the correctional officers come and go every day, and other people, vendors and so on, are coming in and out of the jail and having contact with the people who are in the jail. And that means that the work that we did to reduce the population at the jail and reduce the risk of a COVID outbreak there pays big dividends for the community, because we're reducing the risk of COVID outbreaks in the community. So that was very important work. Joe also touched on the work that we participated in to make our institutions safe, our prosecutors' offices, our public defender offices and courts and so on. One final observation, and that is Joe mentioned that in the city, their jail population had been going down, and that's a result of the efforts that Joe was making as a progressive prosecutor from the beginning of his tenure as a prosecutor, and even going back before that, the previous prosecutor, Dave Chapman. The situation was entirely different in the county. Our numbers were up, not down. And so the measures that we've employed to reduce the number of people in jail because of COVID are also the measures that we intend to employ irrespective of COVID. When I ran for Commonwealth's attorney, I said that we need to use jail as a last resort and not a first response. And so some of the things that we've been doing are things that will continue to be done once we're past this immediate crisis.
Thank you. Both of you mentioned reduction of population in the regional jail. How does we had a question about financial bonds and how that works with population, et cetera. You want to speak to that a little bit?
In the city, we have not used cash bail for 10 or 15 years. And a judge is the one that sets that. And luckily, the judges have bought in to not use cash bail or bond in the city. We're also very lucky with a very robust pretrial court services unit that's able to provide adequate supervision, keep the community safe, but also assist with substance abuse needs, mental health needs, housing, sometimes employment. And the defense attorneys do a good job of trying to help their clients get linked up with services. I'll pass it off to Jim, but we have both advocated for the statewide ending of the use of cash bail through discuss the county, but I believe it's much the same.
Okay. Joe's exactly right. We are, as he explained, in the city, they're not using cash bail or asking for cash bail. In the county, we are not either. And again, this is a strategy that we've used to reduce the number of people at jail. But what I want to make clear to the viewers is that by eliminating cash bail, it doesn't mean that everybody gets out. For those of you who may not be familiar with how this works, if somebody's arrested and they're not released immediately, they're held in jail pending a review by the court of whether they should be released. And so everybody who is released after initially being held has been released after a judicial review of the circumstances. And that review looks at two things primarily. First of all, whether the person who is going to be released is likely to come to court when they're required to come to court. And the second thing is whether they are a risk of danger to the community if they were to be released. So those are the factors the court has to weigh in deciding whether to release them. And by eliminating cash bail, all we're saying is that the court should make that determination irrespective of the person's wealth. Their wealth or poverty should not make a difference in that decision. The decision should be made entirely on the basis of the court's assessment of their risk of appearance or non-appearance and their risk of being dangerous to the community if they're released. And let me add again to something that Joe said about our pretrial services agency, which does a superb job for people who are released, providing supervision and connection to community resources. In addition, our pretrial service agency does an assessment, an evidence-based assessment of those risk factors that I described. So when courts make decisions, they're making decisions on the evidence that's in front of them, plus they have the benefit of an evidence-based risk assessment tool that's used to make those decisions. So yes, cash bail is not a factor in Albemarle County or Charlottesville. And as Joe mentioned, there is legislation pending, criminal justice reform legislation in this session, and I hope to see cash bail eliminated statewide.
Thank you, gentlemen. I've lost my video, but I hope you can still hear me. Is that correct?
We can see you too.
Oh, well, I don't know. Anyway, let me come up with the next question then. We've had a write-in that asked about restorative justice. Is that an issue that is used in either of your offices today? Joe, you want to start with that one?
I'll start off, and restorative justice is a process that is intended to change the dynamic of criminal justice. Right now, the way it works is somebody is a victim of an offense, and the way for the system to respond to that offense is to have the defendant brought into court, and then the transaction that occurs, the punishment that's imposed, the sanctions that are considered, all take place in the context of the state following through with the normal process. Restorative justice says that the community should be involved in addressing the harm. And by the community being involved, what that means is that the person who committed the offense should be held accountable, and that the community should see how that person came to be involved in that offense and look for ways to repair the harm and set the person on the right path. So it's a departure somewhat from our traditional form of proceedings. Now, in order to do that, you need programming. You need to have restorative justice facilitators. You need to have a process where you can have accountability conferencing. You need to have a process where the community can be brought into this discussion. And I think restorative justice is just an excellent approach. And we support restorative justice, but without resources, it's very difficult to have much restorative justice as an alternative to our traditional forms of justice. However, in our office in Albemarle County, we have done some restorative justice work on a pilot basis, and we're hoping to expand that as we go along. But it is, as I say, going to require a good bit more community support than we have now.
Thank you, Jim. Another question that's come in is, talk a little bit about marijuana laws and help us understand the difference between decriminalization and legalization.
I'll start with that. So legalization obviously makes the substance legal. Decriminalization takes it from people looking at the possibility of an active or suspended jail sentence and says that's now off the table, it's just a finable offense. So it's been decriminalized by the General Assembly, and now it's sort of like a speeding ticket. If you're cited, you can be given a fine, but you're not looking at active or suspended jail. What's happened in the city for a variety of reasons with the law changes on field tests and them making one of the substances, I forget the name of it, at a certain level legal. So we have told our officers to not charge it. If it comes up, you can collect it and consult with us about sending it to the lab if we want to issue a citation. And I don't have the numbers, but I don't think they're citing for it in the city anymore because of the expense and burden through sending it to the lab to get an actual certificate of analysis with a test. So I don't speak for Chief Brackney, but we spoke together on a panel sponsored by NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. And I believe Chief Brackney has taken the public position that, we've got other community safety issues we'd rather focus resources on.
Maybe I can add, in total agreement, of course, with that. We have a lot more important things that we need to devote our criminal justice resources to than marijuana prosecutions, especially now that they are, as Joe indicated, an infraction, not really an offense. An infraction is somewhat similar to a speeding infraction. After legalization went into effect, if we had any pending, we in the county that is, had any pending marijuana prosecutions that were being prosecuted under the old law where it was an offense, we dropped all of those charges. So we tried to retroactively give people the benefit of the change in the law. Last thing I'll say is that the legislature just passed in a special session legislation that's connected to decriminalization, and that is legislation that prohibits police from initiating searches based on the smell of marijuana. So even though it's decriminalized and has the status of an infraction, if the police want to, if they observe the odor of marijuana, they can conduct a search. And there was concern on the part of the legislature that marijuana prosecutions and or marijuana-based searches were being conducted on a discriminatory basis, so they eliminated that. So now, under the decriminalization regime, police are no longer entitled to conduct searches based on the appearance of the odor of marijuana.
The Virginia Crime Commission is recommending getting rid of mandatory sentencing. What are your views on that? Joe, you want to start over them?
Sure. So we have some internal policies in our office. I haven't pushed them out, but they're internal policies. We're a small office. There's 5 attorneys in addition to me. And our internal office policy is for a mandatory minimum crime to be charged and prosecuted. It requires the approval of a supervisor. So we certainly disfavor them. I have publicly, along with Jim, joined with 10 other colleagues throughout the state supporting the abolition and end of mandatory minimum sentences. And I'll close with this. I trust our local judges. So if there's a charge with a 3 or a 5 year mandatory minimum, I'm fine to tell a judge someone needs 3 or 5 years, and I'm fine for a defense attorney to advocate for something different and let a judge decide. So don't be mistaken that abolishing mandatory minimums means everyone's walking free and nothing's going to happen and they're not going to be held accountable. In my view, it just levels the playing field to allow 2 advocates on opposite sides of an issue present their cases and their arguments to the judge and let a judge decide. We have excellent judges locally at all levels, general district court, juvenile court, and circuit court. So I am fine, absent exceptional circumstances or an exceptionally violence, with arguing what we think is fair to a judge and letting a judge decide after they hear from the defense attorney and evidence that they think is relevant. So I have been, along with am supportive if the General Assembly wants to abolish mandatory minimums.
Yeah, and I think Joe's made the excellent case for why mandatory minimums don't work. We believe that the judges should be able to make sentences that are appropriate to individual circumstances. That can't happen when the legislature predetermines what a punishment's going to be, and really undermines the whole concept of individualized sentencing in our system. So yes, we need to be rid of mandatory minimum sentences. Now, in Joe's office and mine, and the offices of the other progressive prosecutors who are supporting this legislation, we use our prosecutorial discretion oftentimes to eliminate mandatory minimum charges. So I don't think you will see many of those in our offices. And as Joe pointed out, eliminating a mandatory minimum charge doesn't mean that you're eliminating punishment. It just means that the punishment for an alternative charge can be imposed based on what the evidence is and what the judge determines is the appropriate sentence. So what I would say to the viewers is it's all well and good for Joe and me using our discretion in our own individual offices to reduce the negative impact of mandatory minimum sentences, but we need to have that statewide. And I will say as a final observation that mandatory minimum sentences are driving up the prison population and driving unnecessary costs for taxpayers to keep people whose punishment should be determined by judges and not by the legislature.
Maybe this is a good time to reflect a little bit upon the laws that have come down from the General Assembly in this last session and how they impact, if they, are they positive in your estimation, or perhaps not so?
Jeff, can I suggest, if you ask a question, toss it to one of us so we can get started,
Sure.
rather than leaving it open.
Yeah, okay. Jim, why don't you start with it?
All right. See, I asked for it, didn't I? All right. There's a lot of legislation. I'll hit a few highlights, and Joe might want to add some things. The police are banned now from executing no-knock warrants. And of course, these are criminal justice reform measures, and this is one that obviously is rooted in the public outrage at what happened to Breonna Taylor. So we have that. We have, as I mentioned before, prohibition for police searches based on the smell of marijuana. Here's a big one. We have the legislature has empowered localities to have police civilian review boards, and this is a big change now. And people who are following what's happening in Charlottesville, they know that there has been the implementation of a police civilian review board in Charlottesville. There's not, that's not in Albemarle County at this point, but this legislation empowers localities to have civilian review boards, but it also expands the power that localities are allowed to vest in the review boards to include subpoena power and the power to impose discipline, binding discipline. So this is a huge change in the law. And again, you can see how this is coming out of the terrible instances of police misconduct that we've seen nationally. This impulse to have to strengthen police civilian review boards. Police are banned from using chokeholds. That one's pretty obvious, right? There's also been an adjustment in what we call the earned good time credits. We don't have parole in Virginia, but we have earned good time credits. And earned good time credits allow a prisoner to obtain early release, a reduction in their sentence. So the amount of reduction that's possible for prisoners in certain categories, this does not cover everybody, it pretty much excludes people who are in a violent crime category. But for others, they've expanded the amount of a reduction in sentence that prisoners can get now. And there are a lot more, and I'm not going to go over all of them, but I think the biggest criminal justice reform that has been passed is the elimination of jury sentencing. And this is a little complicated to explain, and I'll try to condense it some and take more questions if I'm not clear. But in Virginia, prior to this law, we had jury sentencing. And what that means is that if a person's found guilty and has a jury trial, then the person is sentenced by that jury. And what that does is, again, it's kind of like the mandatory minimum sentences. It puts the sentencing function in the hands of jurors who really do not have all the information they need in order to make a good determination of what an appropriate sentence is. Judges are the sentencing authorities in over 40 states and in the federal system where we don't have jury sentencing. So as I'm saying, the problem is that the jurors don't know about programs that people can be referred to. They don't know about suspension of sentences. They don't know about sentencing guidelines, which is a huge thing. In Virginia, we try to have consistent sentencing and eliminate disparities in sentencing by the use of sentencing guidelines. Judges can consult sentencing guidelines and have the information that goes into the calculation of sentencing guidelines. Jurors don't have that information. So there's a whole lot of information that jurors don't have, and it makes it difficult for them to impose a sentence that meets all of the needs of the system, because it's not the juror's fault, but it's just they don't have information that they need in order to make that kind of decision. Judges do. So this legislation took jury sentencing off the table, and now juries are required to determine if a person is guilty or innocent. And for those who are guilty, they will be sentenced by the court just as they are in almost every other jurisdiction in the United States. Sentenced by a court that has access to all of this very important information for sentencing. So that was a major reform, and it seems like in terms of impact, this is going to result in additional jury trials, because some defendants were not going to trial, were pleading guilty despite having what they believed to be good defenses, because they were concerned if they were convicted that they would get an unfair sentence from the jury. So I think we're going to see an uptick in the number of jury trials now that jury sentencing has been eliminated.
Joe, do you want to add anything to that?
No, why don't you give us our next question?
Okay. How about the issue of, and you wrote a paper on this, I believe, last year, Joe, entitled, "What is Community Prosecution?" Have you been able to develop that further, and is that showing benefits as you move forward?
I didn't write a paper on it. I plagiarized content from somewhere else. So one of the things that was important to me when I took office was relationships. And I think that's, in my worldview, how we solve problems is through relationships. So Eric Holder, who was President Obama's Attorney General, prior to that, he was the United States Attorney for the District of Columbia. And he instituted community prosecution in that office. And what it is at a very basic level is he took prosecutors and assigned them to certain neighborhoods in DC and said, I want you to get out in those communities and go to community events and attend community functions and get to know the folks that live in the neighborhoods so that they can have a relationship with the prosecutor. They know your name, maybe they have your cell phone number, and you're not meeting them when they're the victim of a crime or a family member has been charged with a crime or they've been charged with the crime. You have a pre-existing relationship with them. And his theory and philosophy was that community prosecution model through developed and enhanced relationships just increases trust. It solves problems on the front end. You're out in the community asking what they're seeing and what they want help with before, law enforcement and criminal conduct gets involved. And so we did implement that, and we have yearly evaluations of the attorneys, and one of the boxes that they're evaluated on is a list of all the different community events and community outreach incidents that they have attended and done outreach related to. So it's very important. COVID has completely hobbled our ability to do community prosecution and outreach. But we do keep a database of what the office is doing on a shared drive so everyone can see what everyone else is doing and where they're going. And again, it's part of the yearly evaluation of the attorneys. And I'm out there doing the same thing myself. And I ask some senior people to evaluate me on it. So I do have a one-page handout largely lifted from what made sense.
Thank you.
Well, Joe's.
Do you want to add anything to that at all, Jim?
Sure. Joe's right. We're living in difficult times, and the COVID crisis has really affected our ability to be in the community and to get feedback from the community. But I share Joe's commitment to doing that. In addition, in our office, we do have a citizens advisory committee, citizens from different parts of Albemarle County, and we keep in touch. It's one way, and there's many ways to establish connections with the community and be engaged in the community. But this is one thing that we're doing in the Albemarle County office to be sure that we have citizens who are there in the community and able to hear from us about what we're doing and also give us feedback from the community about how we're doing. So, yes, I totally share the views that Joe just expressed.
We've had a couple of questions from offender aid and restoration here in town. And one in particular, one was about your staff, and you talked a lot about your staff and the backgrounds and how do you deal with the issues or to combat disproportionality and disparity and particularly racial injustice issues. Joe, you want to try that for a minute?
I don't think I understand the question. Is that staff diversity, or I don't understand the question?
Well, that's my fault. I'm sorry. There are two questions. The first one from OAR was asking both of you and their backgrounds and how they function within your office. And I'll kick that back to Joe if that's a.
Jeff, I'm really sorry you broke up. Just ask it one more time.
It has to do with your staff, the people who are working for you, the assistant Commonwealth attorneys, where they're coming from, what their backgrounds are.
Sure. So other than myself, there's 5 other attorneys. The chief deputy, Arishni Pather, grew up in South Africa under apartheid, and she has spoken quite eloquently about the impact that's had on her and her life. She also worked for Jim at the public defender's office as a law clerk when she was at UVA. I believe I interviewed and hired her for a summer clerkship when she was a law student. Our senior assistant, Nina Elise Antony, her mother hails from Mexico, her father from Germany. And so not only is there some diversity There's also gender diversity. The two senior lawyers in this office are female, which is of great value to me. And then I worked with Mayor Nakia Walker when we were trying to figure out how to do some recruitment efforts, and Mayor Walker was able to get some funding from, I think, an equity, they had an equity fund, and I actively recruited HBCU law schools for summer clerks. And again, Mayor Walker was able to secure funding and housing through UVA for those summer clerkships. And again, it was an active and targeted recruitment at the HBCU law schools. I believe there's 6 of them. And we were able to do that one summer, and then COVID hit. So it's something that's extremely important to me and to everyone in this office and to our community. So hopefully when COVID passes, we'll ramp that recruitment process up once more, because diversity is important for many different reasons.
Thank you, Joe. Jim, you want to talk a little bit about your staff?
Sure. But I want to thank Joe for the idea of the summer clerkship opportunity that's focused on historically Black colleges and universities, and it's ultimately focused on achieving equity. One way that we can achieve equity is to get people into these offices while they're in law school, and hope that they're inspired and by that, and will continue in public service in some area, and bring diversity that's much needed to legal agencies. So I was able to get funding from Albemarle County as well, and as Joe described, he had a shot at it because he got the program going before COVID. I didn't, so we weren't able to do that this year because of COVID, but we do have the funding committed to that, and it's something that I will be pursuing in the future. Again, thanks to Joe. The other aspects of diversity, my senior person, the Deputy Commonwealth's Attorney, is Alicia Milligan, female, and I value her perspective and experience very much. In terms of staff, we have 2 African-American legal support staff and 1 African-American attorney. We also have an attorney who identifies as Latina. And we have the diversity of having people in the prosecutor's office with the different background of coming out of defense work and public defender offices. Myself is the primary example, 43 years as a defense lawyer, 25 years of those as a chief public defender. But Alicia Milligan, the deputy, came out of the local public defender office. Samantha Markley, Shannon Neal, and Armin Zajuri also previously worked in the public defender office here in Albemarle and Charlottesville. And so I think that perspective is very valuable. That diversity of background and experience is very helpful. And in an office that's dedicated to criminal justice reform, it's great to have those people joining in with the others who are may not have that experience, but we're all committed to criminal justice reform. And there's been an awful lot of good culture building that's going on in the office. So I'm very happy.
Thank you, gentlemen. We've already talked a little bit about regulations and laws that came out of last year's General Assembly. This year's General Assembly is just starting up, and I believe this evening we're hearing the State of the Commonwealth address from the governor. And I understand, among other things, that he is going to recommend the abolishment of the death penalty. Do you want to speak a little bit about that, Joe? Would you start with that?
Sure. So I have a somewhat personal connection to capital punishment. I mentioned earlier that I participated in a clinical program at Washington and Lee, Virginia Capital Case Clearinghouse. and we worked with some trial attorneys that were defending a capital case. And I actually attended the case and got to work on some pretrial hearings and motions. And the client was ultimately convicted and sentenced to death because of the work that we did under the supervision of a very, very smart law professor, Bill Geimer. There was an appellate issue related to the Sixth Amendment and the Confrontation Clause that I won't get into, but his conviction was ultimately reversed 9-0 by the United States Supreme Court, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment on the retrial. So that led me in a very personal way, and I got to know the individual through jail visits and phone calls. And so that sort of got me exposed to the death penalty. And, you know, there's a saying that should we judge people by the worst thing they do on the worst day of their life? And I don't know the answer to that, but it's a question worth considering. And then I went to go work at the Virginia Resource Center, as I mentioned, in Richmond, my first year after law school. And a client I was helping represent was sentenced to death and actually got an execution date. And I went and accompanied the director of the Resource Center, and we attended and I witnessed an execution in Virginia. And that also had a pretty profound impact on me. So I will say this, I have said it publicly, and Jim can talk a little bit about this. It used to maybe be difficult to come out and publicly say you were against the death penalty, but I think all 4 Democratic gubernatorial candidates, and there might be a 5th or 6th that got added, but at one point, all 4 Democratic gubernatorial candidates said that they would sign abolition legislation if they were governor. I believe Governor Northam has said he would sign abolition legislation. Again, Jim and I, with the group of Virginia Progressive Prosecutors for Justice, there's 12 of us out of 121 elected prosecutors in the state. We have written a letter supporting the abolition of the death penalty. So I don't mean to suggest that there aren't really traumatic and painful experiences that victims and their family members have gone through related to some of these horrific crimes, but I think it's time to end the death penalty.
Jim?
Yes, thank you. I entirely agree. It is time to end the death penalty. Just a side note here, as Joe indicated, there's the Virginia Progressive Prosecutors for Justice, the organization that he and I are working together in, has 12 prosecutors, and I think there's 121 in Virginia. So for your viewers, that sounds like we're a pretty small group. And I guess we are in number. It's about 10% of the total number of prosecutors in Virginia. But what I want people to know is that if you add up the number of people who are in our jurisdictions, we represent 43% of the population of Virginia. So, and we're throwing our weight as an organization behind abolition of the death penalty. When I ran for Commonwealth's attorney in 2019, I pledged to the voters of Albemarle County that I would never seek a death sentence, and I won't. So I've been on record since the election, and I've been on record way before that for my entire career as a lawyer opposing the death penalty. And like Joe said, sometimes these things are personal. Well, it's personal to me. I've represented 4 people who were charged with capital murder and could have been given death sentences. And believe me, that's an experience that stays with you, just as Joe described the experience that he had in a capital murder case. And I want to say that as I look back on my work in representing these 4 individuals, all men, it's no coincidence they were all African-American men. And I think it's pretty clear that the death penalty is administered and imposed in a racially discriminatory way. And that's reason enough to abolish it. But if we needed more reason to abolish it, I would say that we have a flawed system for determining who should be sentenced to death and who should be spared. And the statistics are that since the death penalty was reinstated by the Supreme Court in the modern era, which was toward the end of the 1970s, there have been 171 people sentenced to death who were exonerated. And if you do the numbers of all the people who were sentenced, all the people who were executed during that period of time, and these ones who were exonerated were, thank goodness, not executed. If you do the numbers, that means that our system in deciding who should be sentenced to death was wrong one time out of every 10. So if we have a system that has an error rate in sentencing people to death, in sentences 1 out of 10 to death who are actually innocent, I think that's also reason enough to question the death penalty. And it goes without saying that if a mistake is made and the person's executed, you can't rectify that error. The person cannot come back from the grave to be resentenced. So those are national statistics, and I will close with something that happened close to home here. The Earl Washington case. You know, people say, well, you know, that's the national, that happens elsewhere, but doesn't happen in Virginia. Well, let me tell you, it happens in Virginia. Earl Washington was convicted and sentenced to death in Culpeper, not far from here, in the same judicial circuit where we practice today. And he came within days of being executed, and he was given a commutation by Governor Wilder, and later he was fully exonerated and released. So mistakes happen, and they happen here close to home. Again, a reason, another reason, not the only reason for abolishing the death penalty. And by the way, the state of Virginia paid Earl Washington $1.9 million in compensation for the misconduct that resulted in his wrongful conviction.
Thank you, Jim. We've had some questions about some other issues that are on the table for the upcoming General Assembly. Two of them that we'd like a response from, and then we're going to have to pull this to a close, I think. One is to expunge nonviolent offenses from records of folks, and also to restore parole. How do you feel about that, Joe?
Starting with parole, there's a lot of great ideas floating around. And one of the things our working group of prosecutors has said, and I credit Brian Porter, who's the elected Commonwealth's attorney in Alexandria, who's been doing this a lot longer than me and is a really sharp guy. He's like, let me see the legislation. Let me see the bill. Let me see what it actually looks like on paper, and not have it be sort of an esoteric discussion. So I am generally supportive of that principle, but I would like to see what the actual legislation looks like. And maybe it exists and I just haven't seen it. But some issues I would want to flag, again, balancing community safety with the fair treatment of offenders, is what type of offenses does it apply to? What sort of victim notification is there that's going to exist to get their feedback and give them notice? And maybe most importantly, if someone should be released, what services do we have in place to help them as returning citizens to reintegrate back into the community? I think you just let someone out with no safety net, no support system, and nothing there for them. I don't think that's responsible to the individual that's being released. So I'd want to see some of the particulars of it, and I'd want there to be a financial commitment to help these returning citizens have a shot to make it and not just be thrown back on their own with nothing there to help them. And again, I would want to make sure thinking through the impact on the victims of some of these crimes, if they are crimes that have victims, how are we going to sort of do notification and get feedback from them? Expungement, here's my general feeling on expungement. If you make a mistake, I'm not sure it should stay with you for the rest of your life. And so I'm very supportive. And I think the letter we wrote related to expungement talked about meaningful second chances. I don't think it's smart or furthers community safety to saddle someone with something for the rest of their life that may be minor and nonviolent. So I'm very interested in that being expanded and looking into the particulars of it.
Yes. With respect to expungement, I agree with what Joe just said. And I think it's important to understand that we have expungement now, but expungement is limited to cases that have either been dropped or where there's been an acquittal. So the legislation that's on the table, the legislation that the Virginia Progressive Prosecutors are supporting, changes that significantly. It changes to allow for people to have convictions expunged. So that's breaking new ground. And it's warranted, as Joe explained, because we know the impact that convictions have on people's adjustment back to the community after they've returned, after completing the sentence that's been imposed. It affects them in terms of ability to get housing, educational opportunity, jobs, just a whole host of obstacles that are thrown up against them. So we very much support the idea of expungement to give people meaningful second chances. And again, understanding that expungement is limited to certain types of convictions. This doesn't go to everything. Now, with respect to parole, we have, as a prosecutors organization, have not taken a position on that, and Joe's exactly right. It needs to be determined what the particulars of any proposed bill are before we can really look at that seriously. I would add in flagging a couple of more issues. First of all, what is the retroactive impact of abolishing parole? Because we had parole and then we abolished it, and our entire sentencing scheme and our sentencing guidelines developed in an environment where there was no parole. So certain expectations, the system had certain expectations when imposing sentences in a no parole context. And now if we're going to change that context, what is the impact on that, on those previously imposed sentences? So that's something I'd be wanting to be looking at carefully. The other thing that I would flag is we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, there's been some movement toward expanding earned sentence credits. And so I think there's got to be some care given to how the possibility of abolishing parole would interact with increasing earned sentence credits, which is another form of early release. So again, I think it's something worth looking at, but we need to know more about the particulars.
Thank you, gentlemen. We're about out of time. I wanted to ask if either of you wanted to make any sort of a closing statement. Joe?
I'm trying to think of something Jim and I disagree on just to make it more interesting, but I'm at a loss. So I'm sure there's something, but thanks again to the Senior Statesmen of Virginia. I love having these conversations. I know I speak for myself and Jim. We're public servants, and we're happy to continue the dialogue and answer any questions that we didn't get to. You can email me at platania@charlottesville.gov or give a call, but we're here to serve the public and happy to answer questions we might not have gotten to today. I enjoyed it. Thanks. Jim, I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah.
Well, again, thank you for this opportunity to meet with the viewers and have a great discussion about criminal justice reform. If you've heard anything in this discussion, criminal justice reform issues, that is of interest to you, again, as Joe said, please get in touch. We're always happy to have further discussion and go into specifics. My email is jhingley@albemarle.org, or you can go through the Albemarle County website, and the Commonwealth Attorney's Office is listed there, so you can come in through that. But if something that we talked about today registers with you as being important, please let your voice be heard in the legislature. That's where criminal justice reform is taking place. It's taking place in Albemarle County and Charlottesville through the efforts that Joe and I are making to change the way prosecution occurs in these communities. But statewide, criminal justice reform is happening at the legislature. they're in session now, communicate with your local representatives and let your voice be heard. That's the great thing about this forum and the great thing about the work that the statesmen do in bringing public issues out so that people can consider important issues of policy that are going to affect their community for years to come. So let your voice be heard, and thanks again for this opportunity to be here. Thank you.
And thank you, both Jim and Joe. We are, senior statesmen are really grateful for the time that you spend with us and for the service that you do throughout the entire community. It's clear that there are a great many questions that we didn't get to today. And it's clear that this is in our community. So I would encourage you to continue this dialogue with both Jim and Joe, and again, to say thank you very much for your time. Let me remind our audience that our February program, which will be listed on our website, is going to be about COVID-19 vaccine rollout. And I wanted to remind you that the registration for folks is already up on the Virginia Department of Health, VDH. So if you'll go to that and you can register and move forward. Again, thank you everyone for tuning in today. We look forward to seeing you again. And I believe that date is Wednesday, February the 10th. So again, thanks everybody. Have a great new year. And as always, stay tuned and stay safe. Thank you.